Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Tamsin Rose, a Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, and welcome to our State of EU, a festival of ideas and politics looking to transform Europe. We're going to ask the question now, what young Europeans want the EU to do? And I'm delighted to introduce the person who's going to share their insight, Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, who's Professor at European Studies at Oxford University. Professor Garton-Ash, please share with us some insights. What do young Europeans want the EU to do?
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. So for 60 years, from 1945 until the early 2000s, three generations of Europeans had known a much worse Europe. They'd known a Europe of war, of Gulag, of Holocaust, of fascist dictatorships in Western Europe, communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. And for them, Europe was a destination. We've been in a bad place, we want to be in a better one, that place is Europe. Now, for the first time, we have a whole generation of Europeans, what I call the post-1989ers, who have only known, for the most part, unless you were in Ukraine or a few other places, a relatively united, free, prosperous, democratic Europe. And the question that we in this project at Oxford have been going after is, what do they want the EU to do? And instead of doing what is perhaps too often done in Brussels, which is to tell people what they should want, we have been out there asking young Europeans what they want the EU to do. I hope you can now see the website. Please come on at europeanmoments.com. We have an amazing series of interviews in which we ask people to tell us their most formative, their best and their worst European moment. You can see them there. The worst, the leader of the worst is Brexit, formative fall of the Berlin Wall, personal travel experiences, studying abroad, the refugee crisis, and so on. We'd love you to come on and tell us your formative best and worst European moments. We then talk to a whole bunch of experts to get their views. You should be able to see this here. You'll recognize many of the people on those pages. But what I want to share with you particularly is our special opinion polling. So obviously, most Europeans care about peace, they care about foreign policy, they care about democracy. But the three top priorities that are emerging from young Europeans, those born, roughly speaking, since 1989, first of all, freedom, particularly the freedom of movement, the freedom to work, study, live anywhere in the EU. Symbolized by Erasmus, but much broader than that. That is something, and you saw it already on those interview pages, which is very high on the list, and it connects to the issue of immigration. Secondly, and arguably top of the list at the moment, combating climate change. Look at this finding from our first poll earlier this year. Most Europeans want carbon neutral EU by 2030, not just by 2050, by 2030. They think governments should bear the primary responsibility for addressing the climate crisis, but 40% say also the EU. And we go on to ask them what steps they would like to take, they would wish to be taken to achieve that result. But here's a shocking finding too. 53% of young Europeans think authoritarian states are better equipped than democracies to tackle the climate crisis. There's a challenge for the EU. And by the way, when we dig into this in our focus groups, it's not so much that people think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are doing a great job on this. It is that they're disillusioned by the capacity of democracies to take the necessary action. We have a new poll, results coming out in late November, asking the hard questions about trade-offs. So you have freedom, particularly freedom of movement, you have combating climate change, and then you have the question of the next panel, which is about jobs and social security and social Europe more broadly. Now here, what is striking to us is, although many people say there's great fear and anxiety, actually, at least in our polling, younger Europeans are more optimistic about their future job security than the old. And indeed, they're more optimistic about their own job security than the old are about the young's job security. But having said that, of course, everybody knows the multiple challenges to job and social security that come from COVID, that already came from globalization, come from the gig economy, and just coming down the road, artificial intelligence. So it's quite clear that the ask for this generation, and here is a challenge, I think, to all democracies, but particularly to the EU, is some mixture of job creation and a restructured social security net. So as most of you will know, the EU wants all EU member states to have a mandatory minimum wage. This, as you can see, is supported by 84% of Europeans, all Europeans. More striking is that 71% of Europeans believe the state should give all citizens a basic income, normally known as universal basic income, UBI. Now, in another poll, we're going to ask, okay, so how do you pay for that? What are the trade-offs? There are hard questions to be asked about that. But the basic message is clear. I'll now come back, I hope, on screen. The basic message is clear, which is we want to keep those freedoms. We want the EU to do much more to combat climate change, way beyond what is already promised in the Green New Deal. And somewhere in that complex of jobs and social security. So if you like, you could think about it as climate justice, social justice, and to some extent, intergenerational justice. We're continuing the project for at least another year. We will have more findings, so do watch that space. Do please come on the website. But I think there is a real challenge to the EU to bridge the gap between what is being promised but not necessarily delivered in the new 7-year budget and in the European Recovery Program called Next Generation EU, and what the next generation in the EU actually wants the EU to get up there and deliver.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for sharing that. And of course, we will make sure the link to the website that you've identified for us will be shared in the chat to the participants. So hopefully more people will come and give you their insight about their most formative and favorite or worst European history moments. Your polling very much matches to some of the work we've done ourselves, but because we have for the 3rd year running done an annual citizens poll with YouGov, and we asked 10,500 Europeans from 11 member states where the EU should prioritize. And 44% of the younger generation want the environment prioritized, which makes it the top choice out of the different options that were put forward. So I guess that's no surprise to you, Professor Garton-Ash, because this very much links to what you felt. But in our next session, we're going to be looking at how we fund social protection. And already the storm clouds are gathering. I'm starting to see media commentary saying that we need to start cutting public budgets and we need to deal with the deficit. So it's clear that there may be cuts to social welfare in the future. And let me ask you, what do you think the young generation feel about the trade-off between these really ambitious climate goals that they want us to work towards and the need to provide some minimum income protection?
It's a great question. And by the way, let me just add one note of caution, which is if you look at the polling on people's priorities for the EU over a number of years, those priorities do vary quite significantly with the great issues of the hour. So if you went 10 years ago, it would be terrorism and security. If you went 3 or 4 years ago, it would be migration. So we have to be a bit wary. We have to keep more than one objective in mind and not say it's all climate change. I think the answer is, first of all, nobody has worked that out, but nobody has worked that out. Secondly, that where we need to go is the Green New Deal territory. The Green New Deal is about addressing the climate change challenge in ways that also create good new jobs and a sustainable social security net. So that's the territory where we need to be, by the way, while also preserving those freedoms that people value, which is a third dimension. But nobody has yet worked that out. My own view is that many of the Naomi Klein type visions for a Green New Deal are quite utopian, all good things at once. And so that's where we have to be. But I think we have to recognize that in real life, there will be some quite hard trade-offs along the way.
Thank you. Let me come back with another question, because your data was showing that young people are surprisingly optimistic about their own futures and their own prospects with job security. And given what we know about the dramatic changes in the labour market that's coming and the impact of COVID, which has led to so many job losses, how do you feel that there is such optimism amongst young people?
Well, a great question again. There are a couple of interesting comments on the chat saying, hey, this doesn't tally with my personal experience. And I think that's exactly right. So as you know, in a polling, very often people say, the public situation is dreadful, but my personal situation is quite good. Here, it almost seems to be something like the reverse, right? In other words, people in private are actually much more worried about their jobs, much more insecure. So I think it's a bit of a puzzle why the polling results are so relatively optimistic. But what's for sure is that if you talk to, we have a team of students from all over Europe, they personally are going into a much more insecure gig economy environment. And so they have very personal concerns about that. And I would also have to say, as you go into older age groups, where people are starting to settle down and have children and have a mortgage and so on, it becomes more challenging. So I don't think we should be fooled about the real nature of the challenge by just a few rather surprising opinion poll results.
And did you carry out your polling during, how much of it was done this year during the lockdown and the experiences that everyone has had? Or is this data from last year?
No. And this is what's so fascinating, that we work with the EU Opinions Project of the Bertelsmann Foundation. And so it's polling in 27 EU member states. And I'm glad to say still the UK, which, by the way, is still very much in Europe. And as pure chance would have it, the polling was done just as lockdowns were spreading across Europe. So the COVID effect is very clear. It's an interesting question whether if we ask the same question about jobs and social security today, we would get similarly optimistic answers. But that I rather doubt. But as I say, let me stress once more again that I think in the territory of a Green New Deal, which is clearly where it's at the moment, we mustn't forget those other dimensions of jobs and social security, of the freedom, particularly the freedom of movement, but also issues like immigration, like hard external security, like common foreign policy. It has to be integrated into a whole strategy rather than following the shooting star of the issue of the moment, as it may already be fading.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you a question. Which of those moments would you have chosen as your favorite European formative moment?
Oh, for me, with all my work behind the Iron Curtain in Central and Eastern Europe, there's simply no question. It's the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the Velvet Revolutions of 1989. I mean, that is still, I'm actually writing a history of contemporary Europe, and essentially there are two giant historical moments in the whole of post-war European history. It's the 45 moment and the 89 moment. And really there's no moment to compare with that since. I mean, it's an interesting question whether COVID will in fact turn out to be the next genuinely pan-European moment since 1989, because, you know, Eurozone crisis was big, refugee crisis was big, Ukraine was big, but actually they impacted some Europeans much more than others, whereas COVID is hitting us all.
Certainly the case. And in my experience, in my own life, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall as well. But it's interesting that a new generation of Europeans, as you've said, for a long time, Europe was a destination. It was an end to the zero-sum game. It was an opportunity to build something together, and it was a hope that we could do something different. But for today's young people who have grown up in peace, who've grown up with this stability, the context is entirely different. So thank you very much for sharing some of the insight from your research. And we will be putting in the chat and make available to our audience the links that you've been talking about. And thank you very much for sharing it.
Great
We would
pleasure.
now like, thank you. And please stay with us with our next session, because we're going to be moving to a session now where we ask the fundamental question: how do we fund social protection? Europe is the only continent in the world that has attempted the huge experiment of building universal access health systems. It's built welfare systems that protect. And we now have to ask ourselves the question, as we move forward in a changing global world: can we afford it? Can we pay for it? And how do we do that? So I'm delighted that we're going to have a few people who will kickstart our conversation, but you, the audience, will help us have this conversation. So let me just explain how that's going to work. You can participate at any time. If you're on Twitter, please use the Twitter feed with the hashtag #StateofEU to share your comments. If you're watching this via Zoom, please use the chat function. But before you do, please make sure that you identify your name so we know who you are. Please, no anonymous people, that's unhelpful. You can raise your virtual hand, or you can put in the chat function that you want to share something. And feel free, a question, a comment, an idea, a link to a document or a publication you think that is relevant for our audience. We're interested in moving the conversation forward. And in our time together, and we have just an hour for our conversation, we'd like to get to some concrete recommendations that we can push for and take forward for the rest of the European project. So our focus is going to be, how do we pay for social protection? And just to start us off, before I introduce our speakers, let me share with you, again, a message from our polling. We asked 10,500 Europeans from 11 member states what areas the EU should prioritize on. And we're going to show you right now that about 2/3 of the population from some countries, so Spain, Greece, and Portugal, said that it's the economic recovery. And perhaps that's unsurprising given the impact of the economic crisis in 2008 and the COVID economy. A smaller number on the other side of the screen, you'll see about a quarter from the Nordic countries, and Germany was saying we need to prioritize the economic recovery. So these are important questions we're going to be asking and thinking about. Where do we put our priority in this next session? So let me introduce the people who will kick off our conversation. I'm delighted to introduce to you Domna Michailidou, who is from Greece and the Deputy Minister for Labour and for Social Solidarity for Greece. Welcome, Domna. We have Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, the Chair of the Elders, and a Professor of Climate Justice at Trinity College in Dublin. And we have Nicholas Schmidt, the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights here in Brussels, and formerly a minister in Luxembourg. These people will each give a short introduction to some questions, and then I'm going to open the floor for you, the audience, because we're going to explore this big question that affects all of us. How do we fund social protection. And just to get a sense of context, we are entering an economic recession, the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetime. In fact, the World Bank says that the result of the pandemic's impact has been truly global. And for most of the world's economies, it will be the biggest economic impact since 1870. That's 150 years. Now, we've been here before. In 2008, we had a financial crisis which affected many member states quite significantly, and we've slowly made our way back. And at the beginning of the year, I would have been giving you good news. Pre-COVID, we had the highest number of people in employment we've ever had within the European Union. We had the lowest levels of unemployment on record. Living standards were starting to improve, and even though there were still significant numbers of people in poverty, those numbers were improving. COVID changed everything. It's a transformation event. At some point earlier this year, 90% of the world's workers were affected. 90% of the world's children or people in education had their education affected. So the impact that is coming from the pandemic is truly huge. And in this session, we're going to explore how do we learn the lessons from 2008, looking forward when we explore how we invest in social protection for the way forward. So let me start by posing my first question to Domna Michailidou. Strong welfare systems have very positive, well-proven effects that go well beyond just paying for social security. They improve mental health. They give people an opportunity to go back into the labor force, particularly women, and for education. And yet, when we talk about social protection, we rarely mention these good things. We tend to talk about the cost. So why is this? Why do we not, in our narrative about social protection, appreciate the positive benefits that they have for society? Domna.
Thank you, Tamsin, for this. I think it's an interesting question, not just for a crisis-stroke country like Greece that suffered for the last decade the impact of the economic crisis, but overall for Europe, given the fact that we're all in the same ocean, perhaps not in the same boat within the COVID crisis, but we're all certainly in the same ocean. So for finance of the welfare system to be sustainable, I think it needs to be understood as an investment rather than spending. And in this context, humans need to be seen and understood and utilized as assets rather than as draining factors. So we need to understand and utilize humans as assets that can enrich the human capital, thus the potential and the development of the country, and thus as assets on which heavy investment should be placed upon. And this has to do, and it takes me back to your initial question on how we understand welfare policy. Do we understand welfare policy as padding up a benefit system, which is the lowest common denominator basically of a welfare system, or do we understand a welfare system as an active welfare mechanism where the state should grant benefits as the least common denominator of social protection, but have an active investment role through services liberating the time of individuals, as well as providing them with the opportunities to train themselves and thus attain higher levels of skills and competences. So I think this is the crucial factor, how we can transform the notion, the very concept of welfare policy from a draining factor to actual investment in human capital and thus the development of the country through an active system rather than a passive one.
Thank you. And Professor Timothy Gartner showed us very high levels of support amongst young people polled for social support, but particularly for universal welfare and universal basic income. As someone who comes from Greece, and a country that was particularly affected by the financial crisis in 2008, what lessons should we be learning? How do we avoid repeating the mistakes and this time put human dignity at the heart of our response?
Well, I think the answer there could be twofold. The one is that actually a country like Greece that has basically through the austerity years of the crisis learned to operate with little to zero scarce capacity, it now has the flexibility and the elasticity to deal with problems. It has, if you want, an enhanced capacity for adjustments. It can do collaborations in a much more efficient and feasible way. It can utilize previously invisible resources in a more efficient and effective way. But on the other hand, there is a limit to operating with little to zero scarce capacity. There is a limit to whether and how you can utilize your little or zero scarce capacity to deal with the pandemic like COVID, and at the same time be able to maintain the rest of the activities of your economy as you can. So yes, the past decade of the austerity years has contributed towards a more efficient and a more, if you want, innovative mechanism of dealing with emergencies. But at the same time, no matter how innovative the system can be, it de facto has a ceiling of how much it can achieve. And this is where us Europeans, we need to stand together and do more to stand up for our own interests.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me now pass to Mary Robinson to talk about some of the issues related to gender, because we already had significant gender inequalities in Europe and globally. And of course, through the COVID pandemic, the majority of the caring responsibilities for families, children at home, for elderly relatives who needed to be shielded, again, fell on women. Women are disproportionately found in public sector jobs, which were public facing, so they were higher risk. They were often lower paid. So there's a huge gender impact in the way that COVID has affected our societies. So let me ask you, how do we make sure that our social protection and welfare systems can try and rebalance this and support addressing gender inequality?
Thank you, Tamsin. There is no doubt in my mind that strong welfare systems are an essential basis for gender equality. And I do agree with the point that Domna made, that we should think of them as investment in human capital. But of course, welfare systems in the past have discriminated against women and girls. There's been quite a lot of discrimination. I remember as a lawyer, before I became president of Ireland, I took a lot of cases to the court in Luxembourg, referred by the Irish Supreme Court or the Irish High Court on discrimination in our social welfare or in our pay. The last case I remember was in 1990. It was a case of two women who were discriminated against, married women who were discriminated against in their unemployment benefit, Cotter and McDermott against Ireland. And we ended up by winning and getting back pay for discriminated married women, because they were getting less pay and for less duration than married men. So this is not a new problem. And I have to say, I really was very pleased that Ursula von der Leyen, in her recent State of the Union speech, stressed the importance of reinforcing Europe's social market economy and of protecting workers and businesses from external shocks. It was good to hear her promise to put forward a legal framework for setting minimum income schemes, and that she emphasized, and I quote her, minimum wages work and it is time work paid. Well, that's even more important for women and girls, because sadly, under the guise of promoting fiscal sustainability in recent years, many European states have cut back on social spending by measures such as reducing benefit levels and their duration, tightening contribution requirements, and strengthening the link between contributions and entitlements. And these have disproportionately penalized women and had devastating consequences on the adequacy of social protection schemes. You mentioned issues like unpaid work, low pay, etc. And now we have COVID, which is far more devastating in many circumstances for women. And that has been, I think, well researched. So investing in strong, comprehensive social protection schemes is more important than ever. It is the way back. It is the investment back to the recovery, which has to be a different recovery and not back to business as usual, in order to help cushion the impacts of the crisis on workers who are losing their jobs or getting sick or disproportionately involved in the care sector, and much of it unpaid. And also I think it's important to point to the social divergences in Europe. For example, in a country like Romania, it's much, much less than in other parts of Europe. And so perhaps we can come back to that.
Yes, thank you. In fact, you've highlighted one of the key challenges that we need to deal with, which is that even with our existing social welfare nets, there were people who were falling through the cracks. And so my question to you is, how do we make sure that our prioritizations are going to those who are already marginalized? And I'm thinking here particularly gig workers, but undocumented migrants. There's a large proportion of them across Europe who have no access to social protection because they're not even recognized by the state as citizens and therefore having entitlements. And according to the European Commission, 40% of people who are in the non-formal 40% of our workforce are in non-formal environments. For many of them, they have zero access. Yes, we can. We have zero access to social protection. And those that do have access have limited, they have higher thresholds to deal with. So our existing systems are underserving some people and other groups are entirely excluded. How do you think we can refocus our welfare to deal with that?
It's an interesting question, Tamsin. Nobody would have wished COVID on our world, but it has done something that is important. It has so exacerbated all of the inequalities that it has in fact exposed the flaws in our existing system, and in particular in the way that welfare states operate. And you pointed out that this is particularly true in relation to those who are marginalized on the edges, the undocumented migrants, the gig workers that Timothy mentioned earlier, especially young gig workers. And we should recall that the EU established in 2017 a European pillar for social rights, which should now translate into a social protection floor for all Europeans. It's that social protection floor that we have to address, that leaves no one behind in that sense. And if I may, Tamsin, it's not quite your question, but I would like to bring it in as part of the thinking of the elders, if you like, that goes beyond Europe. We have to remember, as the ILO has pointed out, that less than half the world receive any sort of social protection. And there is now a movement, which I'm very strongly supporting, for a global fund for social protection. And I think that is an important way of building back better out of COVID, for all of the reasons that COVID has so exacerbated the inequalities.
Exactly. Thank you very much for that. And now let me turn to the next person I'd like to bring in at this point, and it's the Commissioner for Jobs. And let me ask you, you were actually in policy positions in Luxembourg at the time of the 2008 crisis. So you've been through this, you've been through the negotiations. What's changed since then? What lessons have we learned since 2008? Commissioner.
Yes, good evening. I think the first, one cannot say that the policies which were implemented after the financial crisis were absolutely big successes. They have increased inequalities, they have increased poverty, and the pressure was very much on the wage earners, because in some countries minimum wages were dramatically reduced. And therefore I think this time it's different, and it's in that sense different because this crisis is different. In the previous crisis, particularly the debt crisis, we had this impression that some member states had not really complied with basic rules. This time, nobody is guilty. It's a virus. It's just a new situation, and it's global. And finally, we discover, and Mary Robertson said that very eloquently, we discover the importance of strong social systems, because we cannot face this virus without these strong health systems, without welfare systems, because if we are not doing that, our societies will enter into major disruptions. And what our Greek colleague has mentioned, I just want to illustrate it by saying what Christine Lagarde had expressed during a speech, at the ILO, and she said more or less what our Greek colleague has said. Social spending is not just an expense, but rather the wisest of investments in the well-being of our societies. And what we are facing now is the well-being of our society, the cohesion of our society, and we have to make sure that we take care of everybody, because the health of the one is the health of the other. And we have seen in those countries where finally social systems and especially health care is not so developed, they are facing much higher problems than the Europeans.
Thank you. And I like the fact that you have reiterated that it's the wisest investment that we can make. And we made mistakes back in 2008. It's very clear that there was a strong focus on government debt, on austerity, on cutting public services. And yet it's now become clear that that's the one thing that creates the resilience in our society. And when you have a crisis, the resilience is the slack you have in the system. It's a spare capacity to do more. And if you cut your systems to the bone, whether it's welfare or public services, there's no room to respond. And in a changing world with climate and everything else, one thing we do know is there will be more major issues for us to deal with. So the investment in our social protection systems is key. Let me ask you one question, Commissioner. How do we ensure that all the players pay their fair share? And here I'm particularly talking about the role of the private sector, because we've gradually been reducing the proportion of income that we get from tax from some of the corporate sectors. So how do we bring them in so they see the logic of paying their fair share and supporting the costs of social protection that benefits all of our society?
Well, I think the national budgets have been, in many member states are under heavy stress, partly because we are in a global economy where capital can move around, and capital is very often not fairly taxed. When we have a situation when big companies can finally come about with very low taxation rates, though they have billions of reserves, billions of profits, and they are not taxed anywhere, this is a problem which at the end puts our budgets, and especially also our welfare states, under heavy pressure. So I think we have to have a look, and this is part of the discussion now also around the recovery and resilience plan, that finally we have to have fairer taxation systems. And that, for instance, the digital sector, which manages to escape taxation in many places, and you know my origin, you know it, that we have to have at the European level first, but perhaps also at the more global level, fair taxation, because this is a condition to have also better welfare systems. And I think this pandemic should inspire us and lead us to more also internationally agreed measures and taxation, fairer taxation.
Okay, thank you. And just a reminder to the audience how you can engage with us. If you're on Zoom, please raise your hand virtually or put your comment or your question there. For the broader audience, you can interact with us on Twitter using the hashtag #StateofEU. Now, we already have a few people who'd like to come in and share some of their thoughts. And the first person I'd like to bring in is a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Niklas. Mr. Niklas, please go ahead and share with us your input.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Sometimes
yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thank you very much for this very fitting discussion, and also
do you just want to introduce yourself? Sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My name is Niklas Nines. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. I'm a member of the Committee for Regional Development, as well as for Education and Culture.
Lovely.
So my first point is that I think it's very fitting, you know, that the funding scheme is called Next Generation EU. When really all the matters that we saw in the very first presentation are not being put on. The will of the especially younger people is more money for Erasmus, more money for bringing young people together. But really, there's just a cut for Erasmus in there. There's no increase for education. There's no increase for culture at all. We see that there is the willing of the younger people and also of all Europeans to have way more money spending on climate justice, when really there's not so much of an increase in this next generation EU. We have the saying that von der Leyen is really good in promoting headlines, but not really fulfilling on that. And that is just fitting with this next generation. You're calling a next generation, but not asking the next generation what it meant. And for that, I also have to criticize your panel here, when really you wanted to talk about all this post-89 generation, and none of the speakers was born post-89. That's maybe also a point where you should not just try to talk about the generation, but also to talk with the generation. But I have the hope that a lot of people will join in from the chat who are in a younger generation like I am.
Okay.
I want to now point on the question that you raised concerning the financing here. And that is something, you know, in Germany, we have this saying of the black zero, where they talk about we want to have zero debt. But really what I'm afraid of is the debt of climate problems, the debt of not investing in the future. I have problems with building up a new crumbling infrastructure rather than repaying the finance. And so I think that's really the point where we need to go. We need to black zero, not for debt, but for climate emissions. And that's where we need to go. And for the financing, and I'm happy that Nicolas said it in the end, but we really need to get everybody in the boat. We are in this together, and therefore everybody needs to pay their fair share. And it starts with Ireland and Luxembourg, but also Netherlands and Austria, making sure that we don't have tax havens within the EU. We don't just need a minimum income, we also need a minimum taxation in EU-wide. And then for the end of all, for the whole crisis, to be quite honest, I think we need to get everybody involved. And that also means get the very rich involved that are not paying their fair share so far. And I would like to see a one-time rich tax that can be paid off over the next 30 years. And that would be the same thing that the conservatives did after the war to finance all of that. And I think it's a very well working system that we should use as well for the COVID crisis.
Okay, thank you. So you've given us a proposal for a one-off wealth tax that would be used to help make this big leap forward. Let's take a few more interventions because I've got people, the ideas are coming in thick and fast. I'm going to turn now to Massimiliano Mascirini. Could you please share with us, introduce yourself briefly and tell us your input, please?
Yes, thanks a lot, and good afternoon. I am Massimiliano Mascirini from Eurofound. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Very good. Yes. Just linking with what said before, actually, I wonder the question of social divergence, actually. How we can prevent this time that we don't have social divergent trends among the various member states, in order to avoid again the asymmetric impact of the crisis as we observed during the previous crisis. Are we sure actually that the Next Generation EU package has embraced the logic of upward convergence, so that, for example, the different fighting power of different member states do not enlarge or broaden the fissures among the member states as it happened in 2008. Thank you. And I'm Massimiliano Mascirini, I'm from Eurofound. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that. So we need to keep an eye on the social convergence, make sure it happens rather than social divergence, because as you said, you know, after the 2008 economic crisis, there was a huge gap and some countries suffered greatly. And we had countries where lots of people fell out of health systems and fell out of social protection. Let's now turn to Birgit van Out. Could you share with us your input? Start by introducing yourself, please, and then share your comments. Birgit.
Good afternoon. I'm the regional representative for Europe of the UN Human Rights Office, also known as OHCHR, and delighted that our former High Commissioner is part of this panel, Mary Robinson. And as the representative of the Human Rights Office, I would like to bring in the human rights dimension into this discussion. Under international human rights law, social protection is not a benefit or a favor. but it is a human right. And states are legally obliged to establish social protection systems. And that agreement goes as far back as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights more than 70 years ago, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, there are two practical problems that we see in terms of the existing social protection systems. The first one is the non-uptake of benefits and entitlements, because people are either not aware of their entitlement, they do not know how to access it, the system is too complicated or maladapted to the needs of the most marginalized. And the second one is that the one that we heard about from Mary Robinson, is that contributory social security schemes, they actually have a built-in structural discrimination against women, because women still carry the bulk of unpaid care work, and this obstructs their access to contributory social security and puts them at a heightened risk of poverty. So social protection policies must correct the gender imbalance. Now, coming to the question of affordability, this is not a neutral question. Why is it that we never ask ourselves the affordability question when it comes to civil and political rights? Can we afford to hold elections? Can we afford the current prison system? And we even less ask that question about spending in areas that are not encumbered by any human rights, like spending on defense. But to help to answer the question of affordability, Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights dictates that states must dedicate the maximum available resources to social protection. This means that when governments make policy choices, the priority must be given to the realization of human rights that are enshrined in binding legal obligations, as is the case with social protection.
Okay, sorry, I need to move on, but before I do, these things have clearly been a human right for some time, but Europe is the only region in the world that actually attempts to do all of these things.
I think that's quite a strong statement. I wouldn't say that Europe is the only continent where efforts are being made to provide social protection. But I think with social protection also comes the question of international solidarity. And if COVID-19 has taught us something, it's that we're only truly safe if all of us everywhere are safe. And therefore, an investment in social protection as part of international cooperation is not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. But again, it's important to use a human rights approach to the design and implementation of such support.
Thank you. And some of our earlier messages from Mary Robinson particularly talked about the importance of dignity and looking at the gender aspects. Let me bring in a few more people who'd like to share their inputs. I'd like to invite Lindsay, who's one of our European young leaders. She wants to share something. Lindsay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'm a European young leader and the founder of an organization dedicated to girls and women's empowerment. It's called W4, and we focus on technologies, Sustainable Development Goal 5B. So I suppose my question would be directed really towards Mary Robinson. You know, we've seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on girls and women. We are also aware that there's been a lack of a gender lens in government's COVID-19 responses, and I mean, so many people are alarmed. I'm alarmed when we talk about arguably regressing and you know, really regressing in terms of gender equality. And we all know about the correlation between gender equality and socioeconomic progress. So I have two questions, I suppose, for Mary Robinson. One is, how can we hold governments accountable? In a recent report from UN Women and UNDP, the gender tracker of response, COVID-19 response measures of countries, only 12% apparently implemented measures that were protecting gender equality, as it were. And the second point would be, is it naive to think that just as we're trying to grapple with also multiple crises, but the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, and we talk about measuring, we had a great discussion this morning about, you know, should we put a price on nature? How do we do it? Measuring metrics. Could we push for the unpaid care of women to be factored into GDP? We've been able to talk about seeing GDP otherwise, in factoring in happiness, welfare, etc. I'm baffled that we're in my time we're not addressing this more seriously. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you've got a couple of questions for us. You know, why are we not addressing the huge amount of unpaid care? And you're right, there's about 100 million unpaid carers in Europe. The vast majority of them are older women in their 50s who are caring for children, disabled relatives, elderly relatives, etc. And that is unpaid, unseen, uncounted, etc. It's a huge support for Europe's social welfare systems. Let me bring in a few more people so that we can get the conversation moving forward, because it's clear that we've all shared the view, the importance of our social welfare systems, the critical nature of having a social protection floor as described by Commissioner Schmidt, and then making sure that we aren't gender blind in the way we address it, because women take the greatest burden of these things. Let me bring in now Virginia Gens. What would you like to share with us? And just introduce yourself when you come online, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Virginia Marchesi. I am originally from Italy and I'm a UNICEF volunteer, so I'm currently here representing UNICEF Europe. And I just wanted to point out the fact that I think it's amazing that we started this conversation with, putting out there the perspectives of young people, as I think it's really fundamental to include young people in the discussion, but also in the decision making around structuring the social contract of the future and really prioritizing young people's needs and perspectives in social policies and the things that we're going to face in the future, as I think that our generation is really facing one of the most uncertain future of all times, at least in recent years. So I would just wanted to say that I think it was really amazing to put young people's perspective at the beginning, because I think it really shared the light on what's the right path to go in terms of decision making and decisions on policy priorities.
So before you go, Virginia, I mean, you wanted to have young people given a chance to ask. So let me ask you a question now. If you had to look forward over a working life that is perhaps longer than the generations before you, because that's the way we're going for, and you might have to pay more in tax and social security than previous generations, and the amount you might receive at the end and a pension is likely to be less than in previous generations. So you're right, there's a very clear imbalance in that. How do you feel young people want to prioritize social protection? Do you feel that it's important enough that they want to keep investing in it? Or is there a sense that actually, no, they're going to have to work for even longer, they don't want to pay for it?
I think we as young people have a strong sense of social responsibility. So I do think that we really value social protection, and we really value the fact that, people need to have their social rights respected. At the same time, I think that our social rights as a generation should be respected. So when we're planning about the future and when we're planning social protection for the future, we should really take into serious account the fact that we as a generation will want to retire as well. So when we're planning funds today, we need to take into consideration the fact that we will face the consequences of the planning that happens right now. And so that's why we need to be included in these decision-making processes about those policies.
Okay, great. And now we've had some interventions coming in from Twitter. So I'm going to turn to one of my colleagues, Charlotte, who's going to share some of the messages from Twitter. Charlotte, go ahead.
Hello, Tamsin. Good evening, everybody. So we have a question on Twitter from Matilda Axelsen. She wants to know that considering that the Green New Deal is about addressing climate change while creating new jobs, she's asking the remaining question, how are we going to do that?
How are we going to do it? That's the interesting challenge. And we've been discussing that a little bit, the trade-off between the enormous needs of dealing with the big economic recession that's coming at us, and not just at us in Europe. According to the World Bank, the vast majority of the world has not seen this kind of economic impact for 120 years. And at the same time, we're all going through a climate crisis of a similar level of proportion and impact. So there must be a way of bringing these two together to see how we can get the resilience to deal with that. So thank you for that. We will, if anyone has some questions or if you have some comments on that, how we could do this, achieve a balance and not a trade-off, because often in politics, it's a question of a zero-sum game. If we spend money on the green transition. It's not money we're spending on jobs or on social policies. My question for you as an audience, is there a sweet spot somewhere in the middle of this? Is there a way forward that allows us to deal with both issues? Remember, you can send in a comment through the chat or through Twitter. And I'm now going to go to our next input, and that's Frigg Spinnewin from Fianza, who's probably going to raise for us some issues about groups that are very marginalized in Europe. Frigg, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamzin. Frigg Spinnewin, indeed, from Fianza, director of Fianza. We work on the issue of homelessness. I just wanted to say quickly that ambition in the area of social policy at EU level is, of course, very welcome. But I think we have to be realistic and pragmatic as well. The pillar of social rights is the right framework, but it creates really very high expectations. And I think managing these expectations will be crucial for the European Commission. I'm now 25 years in the EU social policy bubble, and I have witnessed moments in which the ambition of the Commission really was not adapted to the political context and the tools available. I guess it should not be a taboo that some social issues are more consensual than others, and I think the EC needs sufficient success stories to keep social policy momentum going. The failure to reach the EU 2020 poverty target is just around the corner. And I have just one quick suggestion, Tamzin, to make. I guess that homelessness, and then I come to your expectations. Homelessness can be one of these consensual policy issues. The urgency is recognized from left to right on the political spectrum, and there is a strong support for stronger EU role. And the policies in place are really, generally speaking, quite bad, and therefore the impact of EU intervention will be immediate and visible. So low-hanging fruit, I think you call it in English. So why not make ending homelessness a priority at EU level? I know Commissioner Schmid is very supportive of that. I think we should try to resist the idea as if homelessness is a too marginal issue and that it can therefore jeopardize the social policy ambition of the European Commission. I think success is more important than the ambition in the current environment, which is still, let's be honest, quite Eurosceptic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And let me actually come back to Domna if you're still here on the call, because some of the messages that we're coming in here are very political. How do we put our emphasis? How do we make sure that when we have to make an investment in our social protection systems, that they are also consistent with this strong ambition? We saw the polls at the beginning of our talk. People want climate action and they want it very clearly. So Domna, are you able to share with us, because you sit in the heart of government making in Greece. I'm sure when you sit around the table with your cabinet colleagues, if there's a trade-off, is the conversation we have to pay for one or the other? Or do you see that within government, people are really starting to get the message that you can't have one without the other? Domna.
Thank you, Tamzin. Well, I'm not sure it's such a competitive element or such a binary choice between the two. I mean, of course, and given the fact that now we have to fill in our own proposals for the Resilience and Recovery Fund, all the billions of euros that we're going to be receiving for structural change programs and reforms for the imminent future, I cannot see how the two are competitive. I mean, within the context and within the framework of the RRF funding, there are two main priorities. The one is digital and the other one is green growth, but they are certainly not all of the times competitive. And in many cases, they can be complementary towards each other. So from what I'm seeing is that the majority of the digital reforms that we are making and the majority of all the services that we are transforming, and as Greece being in the bottom lines so far, at least, of the digital transformation, we cannot even be talking about a fourth industrial revolution and AI, given the fact that we have not really passed the third one. But the digitization of services, of course, has a green component. Of course, the digitization of services and the absence of physical presence, transportation, and all these services, they are complementary with each other. And the other thing that I am seeing through the proposals that we're also submitting has to do with the green growth and the green transformation of the civil service and civil infrastructure as well. So I do not see this clearly as a binary choice. I can see of specific examples where it can get either or, but in most cases, and at least the cases that have to do and pertain my ministry, the Ministry of Social Affairs, most of them are complementary to each other. And this is because all digital transformation that welfare systems need to go through has a very strong green element to it.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm just enjoying the cartoon that's being shared with us, which is, looking behind the scenes, how the world's economy actually works. That on the one side, we've got the private sector companies that are selling stuff that they get, that free stuff from the ground. And on the other side, you've got people, largely women, who are doing the unpaid care, who are making the economy work behind the scenes. So we've got a sharp satirical view of how we see the economy here. We've got about 15 minutes left in our conversation. I have more people who would like to come in, and I'm sure there's a lot of comments happening on both Twitter and Zoom. And as a reminder, at the beginning, we asked the question, how do we pay for social protection? And it's very clear from our surveys and from your inputs that social protection is something that is very dear to Europeans. It is fundamental and a key element in the way we see ourselves and how we define Europe compared to the rest of the world. It's also the key to the resilience after the economic crisis that we're about to go through. In 2008, mistakes were made. We learned and we've done better. We started investing in training and support. And this time around, in the early responses of the pandemic, we saw investments in jobs, investments in people. But already we need to see how that can be kept and maintained as we go forward, because we're about to unleash the largest amount of taxpayers' money that's been put on the table for recovery. And in some European countries, the fiscal stimulus that's been put in place post-COVID is the equivalent of 20% of their GDP. So enormous amounts of the economy are being moved. And it's a bit like shifting the Titanic. It's very slow to move things around. And the question is, which direction is it going in? Is it going towards social justice? Is it going towards inclusion? Is it going towards supporting the transition to a green economy that will allow us to thrive in a changing world? We have a few more people I'd like to bring in, and the first person I'll bring in is Erica Widgren. Erica, please just introduce yourself and then tell us your input.
Yes, hello. So my name is Erica. I run an incubator for new political ideas called Reimagine Europa. And as the name suggests, we are dedicated to thinking about things in different light to bring new solutions. And it's been really interesting to follow this debate, because I think it really underlines a couple of points regarding what needs to be done to make Europe more aligned with the priorities of the younger generation. Firstly, Schumpeter said back in the 50s that you can understand a lot of a society by looking at its fiscal system. And this is something that has been raised in this debate previously, but the fiscal system we have today does not help the green transition. It does not help job creation in most countries. And we have to remember that the fiscal system we have today is, for most European countries, at least over 100 years old. It doesn't work for the current economic model. So what we're looking at now is precisely how do we rethink the system from scratch. But I think the young people have to be a big part of this, because you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that brought them along. And it's the young people that I think will have the new solutions, the people who grew up with the digital world. So I think we have to really encourage young people to help us find the solutions and think systemically about how do we bring the fiscal system to represent these values that have been presented during this meeting. And I think we need to go beyond looking at it from a different perspective, because if we look at the fiscal system, we might not have to choose between one or the other. We could have both, but we need to strengthen how we get the funding as well for this. And this is where I think the really interesting work will be in the future.
So it's how we raise the funds, not necessarily where we put them, because that's becoming clear in the priorities, but it's how we bring them in order to allocate them. Okay, let's take a few more inputs before I come back to try and see where we're going with this. Elisa Cremona, would you like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so I'm Elisa Cremona. I'm from Italy, and I'm a UNICEF volunteer. I actually EU to promote women's rights every day by actively trying to close the pay gap and by helping girls to access higher education. Is there an actual plan the EU is going to follow right now in order to achieve actual gender equality after the impact of COVID-19?
Okay, that's a good question. Do we have a plan to achieve gender equality? I'm sure there is a part of the Commission that has that and that has a plan. And if we can find relevant links, we'll certainly make sure you get them in the Zoom. I'm going to keep going through a few more inputs. So Mbeke Kamara, we'd like to hear from you, please. Again, quickly introduce yourself and share your input. Okay, we'll go to Coco Warner, please. Do I have Coco?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I just had one or two questions. This has been very illuminating and so helpful. My question is going to go to you, Erica, and I wrote it over in the chat. But for all of you, I'm Coco. I work at the UNFCCC, which is the Climate Secretariat. Our job is to support the international climate negotiations, which have been mentioned a couple of times in this discussion. So first of all, social protection shows up as a risk management tool in these internationally agreed texts on climate policy. And then Erica, for you, I found it so intriguing what you just said, the old Schumpeter quote about if you want to understand how an economy works, look at its fiscal setup. Why is it so hard for us to imagine a different fiscal future for the countries that we live in? And would you have any recommendations about where the fiscal shifts might come? I know it's uncomfortable. And I imagine that part of that discomfort is it's really hard to imagine a different future than, the past that we've already lived through. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you've opened up this question of imagining things, and I've always believed, as someone who's been working as an advocate for change, if you can imagine something better, you can communicate it, and if you can communicate it, you can generate ideas to make the change. But this is an interesting point. Why is it so hard to imagine to do something different? I mean, and this is partly because there's such resistance to change, because people at least understand the system they're in. And I don't know if anyone's ever looked at a fiscal rule book. It's incredibly complicated. And what we're talking about is you're taking the minutiae of our fiscal and our economic systems and taking them apart to understand how we can move them towards some of our clear political goals that have been highlighted by our speakers. I'm going to take one last input from the floor, and we've got Jacob Zientala. Jacob, please go ahead. What would you like to share?
All right. Hi, my name is Jacob. I introduced myself briefly in previous session, but let's say I am just a person who is very passionate about European affairs and giving voice to young people. So whenever we are talking, like the point of this session was supposed to how we are going to fund social welfare in new era. And I would like to point out that data is becoming new oil. Like it has been pointed by many people that data is becoming something that every single company on the internet, every tech giant, Google, Apple, name it, is mining this data with or without our consent. And you are making a ton of money from that. So why not tax it? There were great ideas on other side of Atlantic. I believe it was Andrew, okay, I forgot the name. It was presidential candidate. It was Andrew Yang who came up with taxing big companies and creating universal basic income out of this taxes. So I would like to see something like this here in European Union, that we would have at least partial attempt on creating universal basic income with taxing tech companies. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And you've raised the point that we all contribute data. We contribute huge amounts of data to our everyday work, and the value for that goes to companies largely offshore, very little of it comes back. And you've put forward the idea that how do we make sure there is a more equal return on the use of our data? Let me come back to some of our, the people who started our conversation. So I'm going to ask Mary Robinson and Commissioner Schmidt to comment on some of the things that we've heard. Mary, if I could come to you about the strong message we've had about gender equality and young people, and picking up again that social protection, it's not a thing to argue about whether you have it or not. It's a human right. We should have it. Everyone should have it. And I'd like you perhaps to pick up on the fact that even in Europe, with our supposed universal access, we have large numbers of people who still don't have access. We have undocumented migrants who have zero access in many cases. So we're hearing a message from people. They want social protections to meet some of these goals. How do we get there? And do you think there is the support in governments to enlarge our social protection systems to everyone who needs them?
Thank you, Tamsin. And first of all, I'm delighted to see so many young people coming in and asking questions, and indeed the young representative MEP of the Greens challenging this panel because we're not representative of young people. Fair point. The elders actually very much support the intergenerational conversation. If you go into the website of the elders, theelders.org, you'll see we make enormous efforts to give a place and voice, blogs and other opportunities for young people. We firmly believe that young people actually need to be central to decision-making going forward. So I'm glad that theme came through. And I want to answer Lindsay on the points that she was making, because I think they're really very important. No crisis is gender neutral, to be honest. And it's true that this crisis at the moment is worse for women. In particular, if you take the increased rates of violence against women, and girls and children in households, if you take the lack of access to justice even, and the marginalization of minority communities, the fact that COVID disproportionately affects Black and brown people, but also Black and brown women. So we need to learn from the way, as I mentioned earlier, that COVID has exacerbated all of the inequalities, that our going back has to be based on gender equality. And I take some comfort from the recognition that women leaders globally are dealing with the COVID crisis better. And we see that in Europe. We see it with Angela Merkel in Germany. We see it with the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland. By and large, by European standards, they have done very well. And so why? Because women's leadership is problem solving. It listens to the science. It takes tough decisions and brings the people with the country, building a trust. I believe that this will be important going forward. I want, as we come out of COVID and come out, bearing in mind the other climate crisis, which I think about all the time, and climate justice, that we do it with more of an emphasis on gender equality. It is actually essential to that. And on Lindsay's question about the unpaid care of women, and you mentioned the 100 million women. I wasn't aware the figure was as big as that, but I believe it. We do need, in having comprehensive social protection, to make sure that this is addressed. Countries are increasingly also talking about the possibility of universal basic income. I think we need new thinking, and you've got very bright people on this in this audience. I think we need to think again and change our fiscal system so that we can make the changes that we need, not to go back to business as usual, but to go forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Commissioner, let me come back to you, because it's come up quite a lot in our conversation, the issue of minimum basic income. And I know it's occasionally we flirt with it at European level, but this is now a very serious conversation. We know that social protection is going to be key to helping our societies transition to where we need to for climate change and for demographics and for the impact of digitalization on our economies. How ready do you think we are? Is this something that Frick said we need areas where there's some consensus to move forward? He highlighted dealing with homelessness as one. Is universal basic income an idea that's time has come?
Well, I just wanted to say that universal income was a pilot project in Finland, and because that was one country, and there was another pilot project, I think, in Canada, and it was not really followed up. But what is, I think, what I fully agree with is we need innovative ideas because the world is changing fundamentally. And the COVID crisis even accelerates, in a way, these changes. And therefore, we need also new responses. So if you call it now universal income or whatever, we need some kind of security for people in transitions or in difficult situations. And we have seen with this crisis that millions of people lost everything, lost their income, had no social benefit, because they were not entitled to any unemployment benefit or other support. And this cannot be. We have an economy which creates jobs without social security, without social protection. This cannot be. So we have to invent also the social welfare state for the new economy which emerges. And this is, I think, also something the Commission is dealing with, to say what kind of social protection we need for the digital economy, for the platform workers, for all these workers in very precarious jobs. And by the way, is that really an option to have the extension of this kind of precarious jobs, especially for the young? Because this is an issue, when I discuss with young people, this issue comes always back, precarity, precariousness of their jobs. So I think we need to change, and what this crisis should not lead us to going back to where we were before the crisis. We have really to draw the right conclusions in terms of income, social protection, jobs. Just one issue. I believe that the Green Deal can create a lot of jobs if we invest the right amounts into the right places. So I would not have a pessimistic approach to the Green Deal as a job killer. I see the Green Deal as an enormous perspective also for job creation. But at the same time, also the greening of our economy creates losers. We have to admit that, and we have to provide support through some form of income, transition income, skilling, very important skilling to all those who are in this kind of transition in their professional life.
Okay, thank you. And you've raised some key points for us here that, you know, as we move forward, because our economies are changing, there will be more jobs in new areas that we don't know what they are, but we need to support people with the training and skills that they need for that. Not all jobs will come back. Not all jobs should come back as we move to and we transition to a zero carbon economy. We heard at the beginning of our session that young people particularly want a very ambitious commitment to meeting the climate goals by 2030, not by 2050, in the immediate future. And this raises the question, how is our economy going to function? What do we measure? In the session earlier today, moderated by my colleague, we asked the question, can you put a price on nature? And if so, how can you then factor into your government GDP the fact that we're degrading nature for our consumption models? And in this session, I think we asked a similar question. Can we put a price on inequality and therefore make it a priority to tackle it and deal with it? I think it was really a very appropriate point that came through a lot, that we need young people to be part of this conversation about social protection, because after all, they're the ones who are going to have to live with it the longest. And here at Friends of Europe, we believe in that very strongly. We have the European Young Leaders Programme, where we have some of the brightest minds from a range of different sectors who come together to brainstorm and find their way forward. We also believe in engaging with citizens, and we have our Debating Europe platform, which has more than almost 5.5 million individual citizens engaging across Europe, north, south, east, and west, on a range of issues like how do we pay for social protection? What would be a reasonable expectation at the end of a working life? How long should a working life be? How much should individuals pay? How much should companies and governments pay? These are all questions that we are encouraging citizens to explore, because it is our collective future that we're having to write at the moment. And if we can imagine something better, and some of our speakers invited us to imagine big and bold and ambitious, if we can imagine something different, we can communicate it, and we can create the actions to make it happen. So what a fantastic conversation that we've had today, and I hope you found it exciting and thrilling. Please keep discussing. You can keep up with the Twitter chat through the State of EU hashtag. In the Zoom, the chat will continue to be able to be used. It has been a very exciting day, the first day of our week of festival ideas and politics to transform Europe. We're now going to show you some of the highlights of what you can engage with tomorrow. So here you can see we'll start first thing in the morning highlighting something brand new, the bio-revolution, and how that holds promise for part of our transformation of our economy. We're also going to be discussing this challenging issue of changing the big ships in the areas we need to go, so our economy delivers what we want for our society, from competition to trade policy. In the afternoon, we're going to be looking at issues of security and what we mean by strategic autonomy for Europe. And then we'll end the day looking at how we deal with governance issues. And there we have a final cartoon that I think I'd like to leave you with, which is, if we take the word inequality and we get rid of the ini bit, what we're left with is quality. And Europe stands for quality of life. That's been written into the founding messages right when the EU was formed. It was part of the idea that created the EU. Because if you look at the absolute beginning, the preamble, it says that it was created, the Treaty of Rome, 1951, to grow jobs and for a better standard of living for the people in Europe. So quality has been there at the heart of the European project. And when we can get rid of the inequalities, we return to the original message, the dream that the founders imagined for us about Europe. Here at Friends of Europe, we're about creating a new dream and how to transform the direction we're going in so it is consistent and resonant with our new ambitions and goals that are ready for the 21st century. So thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you to our speakers and participants and to all the team here behind the scenes who made it so technically so seamless. Thank you. Have a safe evening. Tune in tomorrow morning. Goodbye.